Hello, friend. Chuck Bennett here. Common sense and common decency tell me that we live in troubled times. America is at a dangerous crossroad, but I have faith in our better angels. Welcome to Letters from an American Optimist. Today is the inauguration of the 47th President, Donald Trump. But my mind has been on a day about 4 years ago, January 6th, 2021. I believe that may prove to be the worst day in American history, at least in the last 100 years. Worse than 9/11? Worse than the day of infamy, December 7th, 1941? Yes, and yes. As bad as those days were, they united our country. They focused America's will on external foes. They reminded us of our common interest, our common purpose. 9/11 and December 7th actually made our nation stronger. January 6th did the opposite. It made us weaker. Long before the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln asked where the danger to our experiment in self-government lie. He then answered himself, quote, "It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher." January 6th divided us exactly in half. It has torn the fabric of our nation like nothing since the Civil War. This day's letter is to our 16th president. I can think of no one whose advice I would rather have than the man who led America through its greatest crisis. Even in the face of his own personal tragedies, bouts of depression, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of fellow citizens, he was steadfast. He never lost his faith in the American experiment or his optimism for America's future. Now, I don't know about you, but here, in the wake of January 6th and the presidency of Donald Trump, I need a good dose of steadfastness, faith, and optimism. Dear President Lincoln, first, let me say that you are one of my heroes. If I could choose anyone from history to come sit by my fire for an evening conversation, it would be you. More than anything, I would love to hear some of your stories and jokes in your own voice. Since, Mr. President, you're able to read this letter, I'm going to assume that you have been keeping up with events. My question is going to be this: has history stopped? That seems like a crazy question, so let me explain. Like you, I've read a lot of history. I've read about empires rising and falling, wars and revolutions, people and ideas sweeping through time and space. We have both taken a special interest in learning how people have been governed through the ages. Partly through your own story, I came to appreciate just how rare and precious and fragile our democracy is. So, I look at the world around me, and as a student of history, I see danger, real threats, not just to our union, but to the very idea that people can govern themselves. My studies have taught me that there are tipping points, moments in time when events pile so high and people's attitudes become so hardened that the tides of history grow irresistible and uncontainable. I think of the French Revolution, our own Civil War, World War I, World War II, the rise of the Soviet Union. All these events could have been avoided. These conflicts could have been peacefully resolved if only people had taken the right actions at the right time. But once the tipping point is passed, no human effort can prevent catastrophe. Here's why I ask the question, has history stopped? I am surrounded by people, good-hearted, intelligent people who shrug their shoulders a lot. When I warn about the dangers I see, they scoff as though I am some sort of chicken little worried that the sky is falling. They see nothing to fear. It's as though history has come to a halt in their lifetimes, that we are not susceptible to the same dangers that have faced humans since the beginning of time. Maybe they are right. Americans today have grown up in the most peaceful era in human history. Sure, there have been wars, our military has stayed busy, but these have all been regional conflicts, and none of them approach the scale of past wars. Overall, the last 75 years have been an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity. And speaking of prosperity, Americans today have grown up in one of the most prosperous countries in the world during the most prosperous era in human history. The richest among us have so much money they make it their hobby to build rocket ships so they can fly into space and build yachts the size of battleships for their vacations. And even though the very rich have stashed most of the world's wealth into their own bank accounts, there is still enough money left over that the rest of us lead pretty darn good lives. In America, except for the poorest of us, we all own toys and tools, eat food, and lead lives that would have been the envy of any of history's richest aristocrats. Of course, people, being people, still complain. Rich people, even though they can afford to fly a rocket ship into space, still think they pay too much in taxes. I'm not saying that us common people aren't facing hardships, because we are. But let's think about those hardships in the context of the struggles faced by humans throughout all of history. The biggest danger to our health these days is not starvation, pestilence, or war. It is obesity. My point is that, yes, we have problems that need fixing, but are they even worth mentioning in a history book? So maybe my neighbors are right. Maybe history has stopped. For example, Russian tanks have rolled into Ukraine. It's the largest military attack in Europe in over 75 years. 75 years, Mr. President. Can you think of a longer time of peace in all of human history? I can't. It seems to me that Vladimir Putin has put that peace in danger. But instead of being worried, the people around me are shrugging their shoulders. Russia's invasion is no big deal, they tell me. Nothing to worry about. My neighbors would rather save $2 or $3 off their tax bill than to support Ukrainians who are fighting the first European war since World War II. Maybe they're right. Maybe history has stopped and we have nothing to learn from it. World War I and World War II are just ancient history. Maybe Russia will just stop at the Ukrainian border and life will go on. In fact, Trump is talking about America invading other countries and seizing their territory. And to do it, he is hiring a guy that the Army didn't even trust to protect President Biden 4 years ago to be in charge of our military. But no one around here seems the least bit concerned. Clearly, they know something I don't. Today, Donald Trump will put his hand on a Bible and swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. He failed to do this the first time around. 4 years ago, he was claiming he had been cheated out of the election, although he never produced any actual proof. He went to every court in the land and exhausted every legal means to overturn the election. So, on January 6th, while Congress assembled to account the electoral votes, he gathered a large, angry crowd, a crowd that he knew to be armed. He stood before them, and he lied, and he lied, and he urged them to fight. Peacefully, he said with a smirk, and then sent them to the Capitol, promising to meet them there. Of course, he didn't go, but the mob sure did. And they did something that had never happened in American history since you, President Lincoln, were 5 years old. They attacked and took possession of the Capitol while the Congress of the United States of America fled. Your administration faced Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia for 4 years, and not once did the Confederate battle flag fly in the Capitol. But that day, while Trump sat in the White House eating snacks and watching Fox News, his mob did. Under Confederate flags and Trump flags, they stormed the Capitol and searched for politicians crying, "Hang Mike Pence." For me, this was earth-shattering. My blood still boils just thinking about it. It seemed like something out of the French Revolution. Surely, this attack was so egregious the president's dereliction of duty so outrageous that all good Americans would rally to the cause of preserving our government. Certainly, we have our disagreements about policy, but surely, all Americans could agree that mob violence threatening the most sacred act of our democracy was completely and utterly wrong. But I was wrong. They don't seem the least bit concerned that the man violated his oath of office. Things happen. Life goes on. Nothing to see here. Nothing to worry about. So maybe history has stopped. Maybe our form of government is no longer precious or fragile. I say that because here we are 4 years later, and Donald Trump is not in jail. He has not been abandoned by his followers. In fact, out of all the Republicans in the country, they elected this man to be our president. So maybe they're right. Maybe here in America we have figured things out. We can just ignore the wisdom of the founders, our fathers and mothers, and toss out the traditions and institutions that the generations before us built into our government to ensure its survival. You see, Trump won 49.9% of the vote and actually got more votes than his opponent for a change. Of course, not once has he ever had the support of most Americans, but he claims this 49.9% gives him some sort of mandate. To do what? We're not exactly sure. But he is using that as an excuse to hire crazy and rich people to run the country for him. And the people around me seem to be okay with this. In fact, the more that people like me object, the more they seem to like it. Even worse, they have this built-in trust of rich people. They seem to think that rich folks know things the rest of us don't and have talents that we can't possibly understand. They have a magical ability to be experts in all fields, even the ones they don't know very much about. This worries me. I don't know about you, Mr. President, but history taught me that rich people generally want to arrange things so that they can get richer. They've never much cared about poor people. In fact, history tells me that a lot of rich people have never actually believed the common people were capable of governing themselves. They agree with my neighbors that rich people are better than common folk. I guess the evidence is on their side. You and I both know that pretty much every single government in all of human history was run by the rich and powerful, and they did it at the expense of common people. Every government, that is, until the birth of America. Preserving a government of the people, by the people, and for the people was why you and so many Americans fought and died. To me, it feels like we are backsliding, that the same forces of human nature that produced thousands of years of autocratic government is pulling us back into the old ways. But I could be wrong. The people around me, with the experience of their lifetimes, well, they're not worried. Well, they have their worries, but no worries that Trump can't solve. That reminds me, President Lincoln. Do you remember talking to James Garfield when he was a young officer in the Union Army? You told him that you thought he could better serve the war effort by running for Congress. He did, and was so successful that years later he was elected president. I think he would have done a great job, but he was shot by a man who had worked in Garfield's own campaign. The man was disappointed that he didn't get a government job from Garfield. That's when we finally decided government jobs should be based on experience and expertise, not political loyalty. This seemed like a good idea to me. Presidents have enough power without entrenching themselves into every level of the government. But Trump disagrees. He and the rich guys he has hired want to fire a lot of federal workers and replace them with people who are loyal to Trump here in America in 2025. Holy cow. That seems a whole lot like something out of a dictatorship, not a democracy. But I suppose I could be wrong. The people around me don't seem the least bit concerned. In fact, they even seem happy with the idea that Trump wants to do away with the FBI. Heck, he's even putting his own criminal defense lawyers in charge of the Justice Department, and no one seems to have noticed. If history has stopped, if things can't possibly change for the worse, well, I suppose it doesn't matter. Mr. President, I know your 4 years in the office were difficult. You did your best to defend the Union, working within the limits of the Constitution. Now, I don't want to bring up a sore subject, but there are historians who criticize you for suspending the writ of habeas corpus in order to silence some of the dissenters who are threatening the war effort. Personally, I think this is a little nitpicky. After all, you were in the middle of a life and death struggle for the nation's existence. So I'm guessing you were as shocked as I was when our current Supreme Court ruled that a president is immune from crimes committed while carrying out official duties. With immunity from criminal punishment, just imagine what a lesser man than you could do while president. Immunity makes the president into a king, and not the King Charles kind of king, but a Henry VIII kind of king. And when I warn the people around me of the danger our country faces in giving this kind of power to a president, they just stare off into the distance as if I'd said nothing. So, Mr. President, I ask you, has history stopped? Are the lessons of history outdated? Is actually knowing stuff the mark of a fool? Am I living in a brave new world where us common folk can finally trust the rich and powerful? Is it time to brush aside the fears of the founders and forget the wisdom of the generations that came before us? I'm hoping you can set my mind at ease. Very respectfully, Chuck Bennett. I stayed up late on January 6th in 2021 and into the early hours of January 7th just to make sure that Congress did its job and counted the electoral votes that made Joe Biden the next president. As I watched the news coverage, I realized that we were at a tipping point. If enough people would condemn Trump's actions, it would turn the tide against him. He would be finished as a political force, and our nation could return to normalcy. I knew people had invested their own integrity into their support of Trump, and that to reject him was to admit error. But here was the off-ramp. Just like the leader of the House Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, and the Republican leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, I publicly condemned Trump's actions and placed the blame for the violence on his shoulders. I wanted to add my small voice to what I hoped would be a rising chorus of indignation. Alas, we passed that tipping point, and nothing changed. McConnell failed to vote for Trump's removal, and McCarthy soon begged Trump for forgiveness. For myself, I had colleagues, fellow teachers, go to my boss and complain that I had publicly criticized Trump, although none of them said a word to me. I learned later that while the mob was attacking the Capitol, a few of my colleagues were huddled in a classroom behind closed doors, watching the events unfold, laughing and cheering. It is hard to be idealistic in this old world. It is hard to be steadfast when events pile up. It is hard to keep your optimism when the people around you harden. To me, that's when the study of history is most important. There, learning about the struggles and triumphs of humanity and the examples of men like Abraham Lincoln, that I find the strength to be steadfast and the inspiration for my idealism. It's history that renews my optimism. Next time, I plan to read you my letter to Rush Limbaugh and explain how I discovered he was actually a communist. I hope you'll be back to hear it. Now, and if you want to like this or subscribe, that'd be great. Even better, tell a friend. We need all the help we can get.